Coverage measurement is simply a way of describing how much of a system you're testing actually exercises, as opposed to how much you hope it exercises. It gives you a structured vocabulary for answering a deceptively hard question. When a test suite passes, what parts of the code and behavior did it truly touch, and what parts remained untouched, and therefore uncertain? In practice, coverage is not about perfection, and it is about reducing blind spots in a way you can explain to engineers, leaders, and auditors without hand-waving. If you keep that framing in mind, coverage becomes less of a vanity metric and more of a practical instrument for understanding confidence and residual risk.
Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. When people say coverage, they often mean code coverage, but even that term hides several related concepts that behave differently. Code coverage usually refers to whether lines or statements ran at least once during testing, which is useful but can be misleading because a line can execute without being meaningfully validated. Branch coverage goes one step further by checking whether each decision point, like an if statement, has been exercised in both directions, which better reflects decision logic. Path coverage is the most demanding conceptually because it concerns sequences of branches through a function or module, and the number of possible paths can grow rapidly as complexity increases. These types are best understood as lenses, not scores, because each lens reveals a different kind of untested behavior. Functional coverage shifts attention from code structure to what the system is supposed to do, and it maps tests to features, requirements, and expected behaviors. This approach treats the application as a set of capabilities, such as user enrollment, payment processing, or report generation, and it asks whether each capability is validated in ways that reflect the documented intent. In secure engineering, functional coverage matters because many failures are not line-level defects and are instead broken workflows, incomplete requirements, or mismatched assumptions between components. A test suite can execute a large portion of code while still failing to validate essential behaviors, especially when the most important behaviors are cross-component flows. By tying tests to requirements and expected outcomes, functional coverage helps you detect where the system's promises have not been verified.
Security coverage is a parallel idea, but it maps tests to threat areas, security controls, and critical flows that matter to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Instead of asking whether a feature works, you ask whether the feature resists misuse and whether the controls around it actually activate under stress. This often involves aligning tests to categories like authentication, authorization, session management, input handling, cryptographic protection, and logging, while also tracing high-value flows like account recovery, privilege elevation, or data export. Security coverage is not only about having a test, and it is about testing the control's effectiveness in the places where real adversaries would apply pressure. When done well, it turns security testing from scattered checks into a coherent map of how you are defending the system.
Boundary testing targets the edges where systems fail in ways that normal test cases rarely reveal, especially around input limits, error handling, and exceptional cases. Every interface has boundaries, including maximum lengths, allowed character sets, numeric ranges, and timing assumptions. And attackers routinely work those boundaries because that is where parsing bugs, truncation bugs, and validation gaps live. Boundary testing also applies to operational boundaries like rate limits, retry behavior, and resource exhaustion because security controls can behave differently when the system is overloaded. The goal is not to break the system for sport, and it is to learn how the system behaves at the margins so that failures are controlled, observable, and safe. When boundary testing is absent, coverage can look high while the most fragile logic remains unexamined.
Negative testing is closely related, and it verifies that the system rejects invalid requests and unauthorized actions in predictable, defensible ways. This is where you validate that validation exists, meaning inputs that should be rejected are rejected, and operations that should be denied are denied, even when they appear plausible. In secure systems, negative testing focuses on permission boundaries, state transitions, and misuse of functions that are valid in one context but dangerous in another. It also includes confirming that error responses do not leak sensitive information, do not create inconsistent state, and do not allow partial success that bypasses intended checks. The point is to prove the system can say no reliably, because many security incidents begin with a system that is permissive under unexpected conditions.
Coverage gaps are what remain when you compare what you tested to what exists, and those gaps often represent unknown risk rather than known safety. Untested modules can include legacy code, rarely used administrative features, background jobs, or integrations that were added under deadline pressure and never fully validated. Untested workflows can be more subtle, such as alternate paths through an onboarding process, fallback behaviors during outages, or state changes that only occur after long periods of use. The danger is not only that a gap exists, and it is that nobody can describe what the gap contains, which makes prioritization and accountability difficult. Mature coverage practice treats gaps as inventory because you cannot manage risk in components you have not even acknowledged. Measurement only becomes meaningful when tools and definitions are consistent across teams and releases. Otherwise, you end up comparing numbers that do not refer to the same reality. Teams can inflate or deflate coverage without intending to, simply by changing what counts as a test, which environments are instrumented, or which kinds of code are excluded. Even basic terms like line coverage can differ based on language, tooling, build configuration, and how generated code is handled, so consistency is a governance problem as much as a technical one. For security coverage, consistency also means using stable taxonomies for threat areas and controls so that a test written this month is categorized the same way next quarter. Without shared definitions, coverage metrics become a debate about measurement rather than a discussion about risk. Risk-based coverage is the idea that you do not treat all code and all workflows as equally important, and you emphasize the components where failure has the highest impact. High-impact components often include authentication and authorization services, payment and billing paths, key management flows, administrative interfaces, and any functionality that touches sensitive data at rest or in transit. Risk-based thinking also considers exposure, meaning public-facing interfaces and high-volume endpoints deserve more attention because they provide more opportunity for abuse. This approach is not an excuse to ignore low-risk areas, and it is a way to sequence work so that limited testing capacity buys the most reduction in real-world risk. The measure of success is not the highest possible number, and it is whether the most consequential failure modes have been actively exercised and constrained. Third-party components complicate coverage because they reduce visibility into internals and require different assurance approaches than you use for code you own. When you rely on libraries, software development kits, and external services, you may not be able to instrument their internal branches or paths, and you may not even have source code in a form that supports detailed measurement. That does not remove the risk, and it simply moves the focus to interface behavior, configuration correctness, patch status, provenance, and the security properties you can validate externally. For some third-party dependencies, assurance may rely on vendor attestations, independent assessments, or contractual controls, but you still need tests that confirm your integration is safe. In other words, you trade deep internal coverage for a combination of boundary tests, misuse tests, and verification of control assumptions at the points where your system touches the dependency. Automation expands coverage by making it cheaper to run more tests more often, and it helps you keep pace with rapid change and frequent releases. Automated testing is especially strong at regression detection, input variation, and repetitive validation of known behaviors, which are essential for maintaining baseline security controls. However, automation can miss logic errors and abuse cases because those require imagination, adversarial thinking, and context that scripted checks do not always capture. It is common to see highly automated suites that exercise many lines of code while still failing to test authorization nuances, multi-step workflow manipulation, or business logic abuse that looks like normal use. The healthiest view is that automation broadens the surface you touch, while targeted human-driven security testing probes for the clever failures that automation is least likely to anticipate. Trend tracking is how you turn coverage measurement from a snapshot into a story, because it shows whether coverage improves, stagnates, or regresses over time. A single coverage value is easy to game or misread, but a trend reveals patterns, like slow erosion during rushed delivery cycles, or steady improvement after tooling and definitions stabilize. Trends also help you detect when a major refactor introduced new code paths faster than tests were updated, which is a common source of hidden risk. For security coverage, trend tracking can highlight whether critical flows remain consistently tested after changes in authentication frameworks, permission models, or data handling practices. The key is to interpret trends alongside release events and architectural changes, so you understand why the curve moved, not just that it moved. Coverage metrics must be interpreted with quality in mind, and they should never be treated as absolute proof that a system is safe. High line or branch coverage can coexist with shallow assertions, weak oracles, and tests that only confirm the happy path, which means the system is executed but not meaningfully validated. Even strong functional coverage can be misleading if requirements are incomplete, if tests are written to match implementation quirks rather than intended behavior, or if the environment does not resemble production in security-relevant ways. Security coverage is similarly vulnerable to false confidence when tests check for the presence of controls rather than their effectiveness under realistic misuse. The responsible stance is to treat coverage as evidence of attention, not evidence of correctness, and to combine it with findings, threat-informed testing, and observed behavior in production monitoring. Coverage measurement supports confidence when it is tied to meaningful risk areas because it helps you explain what you tested, what you did not test, and why that allocation makes sense. It gives structure to prioritization by revealing gaps, focusing effort on high-impact paths, and making the hidden parts of the system visible to decision-makers. It also creates a common language across engineering and security so that improvements can be tracked over time without relying on anecdotes. When you keep coverage grounded in risk and interpret it with humility, it becomes a powerful tool for trustworthy validation rather than a number that invites complacency. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.